if you think that the reason the Democrats have lost because they moved to the center, or because they've lost the center because of the left and everything, then it has a whole series of strategic ramifications that come out of that. But if what's actually going on is something else, then a whole series of strategic ramifications come out of that assumption. So that's why this whole thing is important. And it's our belief that it is not that what that Democrats have moved to the left and all this stuff about education polarization and like the staff making decisions, this whole story. What we believe actually has happened is over the past 50 years, the right wing has become ascendant and so dominant.
Hello, friends, and thank you for joining us on Charting the Way Forward, where we deliver research-informed strategy and intelligence from across the Democratic coalition. This podcast is produced by Way to Win, where we aim to upend politics as usual. I'm your host, Kerry, and today I'm joined by
Jennifer Fernandez Ancona, co-founder and chief strategy officer at Way to Win.
And Dan Ancona, consultant and media and research person, also at Way to Win.
All right, we've got a partner duo here, and it's our first time, so I'm hoping to keep them. I don't want any rows here, guys. That's all. Just kidding. So we are going to get into some research today and the question of whether Democrats would be strategically better off hewing to the center or to the left in order to win future elections. But before we do that, it's worth taking note that the uncertainty everyday Americans are experiencing right now through lost work, lost wages, lost benefits, and lost services has now visited the stock market too, which has plummeted over the past week. I'm not even going to get into numbers because by the time we post this, who knows what erratic thing will have happened. But what we are finding out through this chaotic experiment that Donald Trump and Elon Musk are conducting on our nation is that while it's really, really difficult for a president to unilaterally goose the economy, particularly in a short amount of time, it is quite easy for a madman to unilaterally destroy an economy in short order. And I mean, by madman, I mean a president. So I just wanted to bring that up because the uncertainty that we are seeing in the markets reflects the stress tests that Donald Trump and Elon Musk are putting the entire American people through. Okay, so topic, I just want to get into this just to set this up. There was a New York Times article this week. And I want to dive into a debate that's been brewing in the Beltway over the strategic direction of Democrats moving forward and to moderate or not to moderate, right? That debate showed up in a big way this week in a lengthy piece from New York Times analyst Thomas Edsall, who interviewed a mostly white, highly educated, I think he included one person of color, about how Democrats should win elections. We always like to have a monolith in terms of those. But basically, Edsall's assumption in the piece was that Democrats clearly should moderate. And his main area of inquiry wasn't really should they or shouldn't they, it was whether they could. In other words, could they break free from the shackles of liberalism? So I say that it's a little bit of a just there, but Dan, do you want to take first crack at addressing what Thomas Edsall did here?
Yes, please. And first, we in the discussion while we were setting this up, this kind of came up. We realized no one sane wants to continue to relitigate what happened in 2024 and what's going on. But just so that we're all clear, the reason this is important is because it has huge impact on what's happening right now, right? It affects everything from what's going to happen in 2026 and in the run up to the congressional elections. It happens on day-to-day stuff, what's happening right now with the continuing resolution fight in the Senate. All of this stuff is impacted by this narrative of what happened in 2024. So we know that There's people are like, no, not again, no more. But this is all really important, and this is why. And what's happening with this Etzel piece, and we're starting here because in some ways this is such a perfect condensation of the kind of thinking that we are trying to challenge and trying to like come up with new approaches to. And the whole assumption behind this piece is that Democrats they're losing because they moved away from the center and they have to get back to the center. This is the whole thing. And we were sort of asking about this. We were like, is that really what this piece said? No, really. The title of the piece is even if Democrats can move to the center, it may not help. The whole framing of the thing is set up around that. And if you think that the reason the Democrats have lost because they moved to the center or because they've lost the center because of the left and everything, then it has a whole series of strategic ramifications that come out of that. But if what's actually going on is something else, then a whole series of strategic ramifications come out of that assumption. So that's why this whole thing is important. And it's our belief that it is not that Democrats have moved to the left and all this stuff about education polarization and like the staff making decisions, this whole story. What we believe actually has happened is over the past 50 years, the right wing has become ascendant and so dominant, and this has had two main effects. One of the effects was on the policy side, is they have passed a whole series of rules on everything from monopolies to tax policy to unionization to keeping the minimum wage low, a million different things. They have drained more than $50 trillion from the 90% of the country, from most of us. And it's not, somebody said the other day it's the top 1%. It's not the top 1%. It's a 0.01%. It's some fraction of the top 1% have done this. This 50 trillion is more than 50 trillion at this point, is one big factor of that. The flip side to that is they took a lot of the money that they were saving on taxes and invested it in right-wing media, right-wing persuasion infrastructure that we now see the effects of. And for a long time, the Democrats could kind of fight them to a draw with this, because our policies kind of worked better and people knew we were for the little guy, like we were okay. With the rise of social media and with the rise of Trump, that advantage has been upended. They now have it is locked in a permanent. All this investment in media and persuasion has locked in an advantage for them that's very, very challenging. Two different stories about the same thing that's going on with very, very different ramifications.
Yeah, I think, I mean, of course I agree with all of that. And I think what, what is interesting about this is like, there is such a deep conventional wisdom. You hear it spouted off all the time from people about, thinking about decisions that are going to be made. For example, who is our nominee going to be in 2028? That's a really big decision. And I've been in a lot of rooms this week and conversations this week where everybody is like, who is our leader? What does our leadership look like? People really want to know that. And it really matters who that is because like it sets the tone, who they are, how they position, what their messaging is, etc. And so I just think it's interesting that you can hear everybody just say like, well, of course we need to make sure we have the most centrist candidate in 2028. I've heard that from like several people, even people I actually really respect, which is like, okay. And if you read through that Edsel piece, which I know we're going to talk about next, like there is some really interesting elements in there that some of the people interviewed brought up of like actual studies that have been done that show maybe that's not totally the case, and that there's a consequence to moving to the center, that it's like people talk about it like it's just obviously that's what should be done. It's just so baked in to common sense, which is what Dan was saying of like even the premise of, or Kerry, even the premise of the piece was just like, can they even do it? Of course, it's obviously what should be done. But like we have seen firsthand, and I think we've also been shouting from the rooftops for a while, that's like there can be a consequence, which is that when you view what you have to do is build a big coalition, which is diverse between how people think ideologically, what their life experiences are, etc. If you just have this moderation tacked to the center, you can end up losing the enthusiasm of people who would normally be with you, and that can actually cause you to lose the election. So I think that is a really important idea, and I know we're going to talk more about with the specifics on that, but that's how I
Absolutely.
think about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I will say, so first of all, I just want to say, I don't think, I personally, I'm just going to throw out my personal belief. I don't think we need someone who's moderate. I think we need someone who is not necessarily establishment and doesn't go through do like in terms of a leader and a
Yeah.
candidate doesn't do things in the this is my own personal belief. So I'm not going to
Right.
say that's way to wins. That's
No, no,
Carrie
no.
Eleveld. Yeah.
I get that. But the one thing I was going to bring up, maybe you were going to go here, is it this belief that that's what is needed leads to things like Gavin Newsom, right? Like this week or whatever,
Exactly.
bringing this psychotic right-wing nationalist person, Charlie Kirk, on his show, which I heard in so many like, progressive activist rooms this week, people bringing up as like, that makes me really upset and I don't want to be vote for him and I don't want him to be our standard bearer. So it's kind of like a perfect encapsulation of that, right? It really did like yes, it got attention and yes, it hit a nerve, but it like it did have that effect of like depressing the excitement on the base Democratic side in the hopes that he would be seen as someone who's more moderate.
That's right. That's right. So, and that's exactly where I was going, even though I threw in my own personal belief, but it's exactly where I was going. No. And so Gavin Newsom is making decisions about how he's trying to present himself based on the assumption that he
Exactly.
needs to moderate in order to win, right? And yet
Right.
all these people are like, ooh, is that, it's like, well, here's, if you really want us to moderate, this is what it looks like. It's like horrible, right? It's gut wrenching.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
So
just
oh, sorry,
really
go on.
really quick on that, the logic of this from the people who believe these things is that the people in the rooms that Jennifer was talking to don't matter, right? Is that like it's a small group of people, whether they vote or not is, kind of irrelevant. There's way more people that you can pick up by converting votes in the center. I mean, this is the whole basis of the never Trumper argument, right? This is why they focus on, they
Mhm.
talk to, Trump voters way more than they talk to people who didn't vote, is that those flips, it's the whole 2-for-1 argument, right? If you flip one voter, you take a vote away from someone and, from your opponent and you win them, right? However, as we've seen, and we're going to have data on this soon, we know that roughly there were 19.1 million Biden voters in 2020 that did not show up in 2024. And it's one of those things where, like, in certain elections, they were probably right. The left was a pretty small group and they could ignore it. But the moment that I always think about was there was a moment in like, Jennifer will remember this with more detail than I do. Yeah, I want to say it was like the spring of 2023 where we were trying to recruit someone to do an ad, a pro Harris ad. And we're trying to recruit someone from the grassroots. And because of the situation in Gaza, we couldn't find a single person who was willing to publicly like endorse her as part of their organization, right?
Endorse Biden. Like
Endorse. No, sorry,
basically,
right. It was Biden at the time. Exactly. It was Biden at
yeah.
the time. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it was so, and
It was
like
over
the whole,
immigration too.
there were a couple things, right? And there were, if you looked at the polling, like Gaza was always really low in salience, right? Like nobody was telling pollsters, yeah, Gaza is my top priority, right? But
Yeah.
like that, the way that whole salience polling stuff works, it's like it's kind of complicated, right? Like people will say, I'm most concerned about prices, and they'll rank that higher, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to like have a perception or have a narrative about a candidate that's based on some other issue, on immigration or on they were more pro-immigration. They were worried about what the Democrats were saying about immigration, like from the left. Like the Democrats
Mhm.
were saying very right-wing things about immigration, and they were concerned about that. And you can't really get at that clearly always in a simple salience poll, right? Like it's like you can do forced
Mhm.
choices and do, or better yet, go qual and just go talk to people.
Okay,
But
Right.
it just comes back to that moment. And like I think that was like that's where this gets a little complicated. One of the places.
that's that's an interesting segue right into a piece of research that was actually included in the Edsel piece that is actually, you know, based on empirical data, right? And not so much like polling and what you subjectively think that polling is telling you. One of the people quoted in the article, who really Edsel pretty much brushed past, was Stanford poli sci professor Adam Bonica or Bonica. I actually don't know, but I apologize if you're listening. Clearly he is, and I slaughtered your name. But anyway, he argued, hopefully we'll do better with your research than I did with your last name.
We will have him
He
on.
argued,
Adam,
what'd you say?
Dr. Bonica, if you're listening,
Yeah,
please, we'd love to have you on.
Yeah.
we actually really want to
Reach out
have
to
you
us.
on. We will be reaching out. We'll find you. But anyway, he argued that Democrats' best electoral outcomes happen when they don't moderate, a la 2008, 2018, and I'd like to say 2028 would be a nice like bookend to that trend. But here's what he said. Here's what he's quoted as saying in the piece. The empirical evidence is increasingly converging around a clear conclusion. There appears to be very little electoral advantage from running to the center in contemporary congressional elections. Okay. And he expounded on this in a tweet thread. And I just want to, the first tweet he included, I think we're going to be able to put this up on our YouTube for anyone who watches on YouTube. We'll be able to put up a picture of this tweet. We'll also include the tweet thread in the show notes. But he had these two graphs.
These are in Blue Sky. Just so
Yeah,
no one
Blue
gets
Sky.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, exactly. Yeah, he tweeted out this. We're not revealing
He skeeted
anything.
it.
He skeeted it. Sorry, my bad. Skeeted. All right. So, right. It's Blue Sky. Blue Sky, I say, not that other right-wing platform that shall not be named. Anyway, so, these two graphs that he had in this skeet, both had 2008 when then candidate Barack Obama was running for office for president. And he is at the pinnacle of both graphs. And one graph is about how much turnout there is. So he's at the pinnacle of how much turnout there is, right? And then the other graph is whether someone went to the left or to the right in terms of or whether candidates went to the left or the right in terms of their arguments, their policies, etc. And Barack Obama is not only, 2008 is not only at the pinnacle of the top of that chart, but it's also the furthest left in that chart. So it's like, I realize that he's talking about congressional candidates here and the professor, but also like that 2008 was a very top-down year. The entire Democratic Party was infused with the optimism and the messaging and the bold change, vehicle that sort of Barack Obama was presenting and putting forward as a candidate. And that was Democrats' biggest turnout year relative to Republicans and also most progressive or bold or whatever you want to say messaging year. So I thought that was an interesting thing. I mean, Edsel brushed past it and then quoted someone from Third Way for a lengthy period of time who actually didn't cite any evidence. I'm sure they have something. But anyway, but I just wanted to settle for a minute on this research and what it told us. Dan, Jen, do either one of you want to weigh in about this?
For sure.
Right. We were right.
Yeah. Dan joked in our private internal team Slack. That's a lot of words for saying way to win was right. And I mean, it really rings true. And what I was thinking about this morning when I was reading it was like, and we were just kind of starting to talk about this with the example of we couldn't find a person who would be in a testimonial ad to talk about all the things that Biden had done that were actually good because they were upset about Gaza, right? Or because they were upset about immigration policy. And it's like, when we started to see all these warning signs, that was the beginning of it. We started to see a lot more and hear a lot more from the ground. I mean, we're really, because Way to Win has funded a lot of, base building kind of organizations that are really in touch with people on the ground who are not just progressive, but like, Democrats, like real Democrats who are kind of like activists and part of this. It's like, we were hearing all of this concern that people are depressed, it doesn't look like we can't get people to turn out. And we were seeing these warning signs. And we actually wrote a whole memo post the Michigan primary when the uncommitted movement had gotten 100,000 votes. And we really spell it out, which is this idea that like what we said in the beginning of this was that we understand that the past 3 cycles have reminded us politics is a game of addition, and we're winning through a both and strategy of unifying voters across an ideological spectrum to defeat MAGA. And this cycle, we have all seen the polls and we know how close it'll be at every level, and that all of these voters, especially youth and voters of color who we're hearing all these warning signs from, are an essential part of the winning coalition. So, like, that is our theory. Like that is what we were coming in saying. Like this is a both and. We need people to be excited. We need people to turn out. And we understand that we have to persuade, people in the middle and like hold that big diverse coalition. But what we were calling out, which is what I think the point of this study gets at, is that if you have too much of a moderation, and so that, which is kind of what happened in this last election, although it wasn't only issue based, it was also just Biden's age and other concerns that people had. But like what happens is that base gets depressed, and it's like what we said in this memo was the part of the base are the people that we need to knock doors, give money, send texts, write postcards, say positive things about Biden, online to their friends and family. And like,
I just want to make sure online got in there because I think that's what's changed like recently.
yeah, exactly. And that like if that group is disenchanted or and demobilized, it's like what we said in this memo was there's just a real and present danger that too many voters in these swing states who are fed up with the system will choose to either not vote at all, vote but skip the presidential ballot, or vote for third party candidates. And it's like we wrote that in February of 2024. So we were, you know what I mean? Like we've been in this whole fight where it's like we know that to be true, that if like you don't have those elements where you have an engaged base, it's harder to win an election. And I think I was just gratified the the study because it was a sort of concrete data driven analysis of my own analysis that I've been kind of pushing and living for the past several years.
Right. And we have, I mean, lest we get sort of thrown into the like mobilization bucket, a big critique of our strategy, of way to win strategy, has been that we just, and this is kind of where we started out. We thought there was a big pool of voters that were like sort of naturally lefty that like weren't being talked to that would, potentially be a winning part of the winning coalition. And it's like this situation is just a lot more complicated than that. And like we have those voters are contested, right? Is one of the things that we found is like the right has made an extremely aggressive play for those voters and trying to communicate with them and trying to engage them. Like that's one factor. It's never been a demographics is destiny thing. We disabused ourselves of that notion pretty quickly the moment we started to look into this. But our strategy, way to win strategy has evolved over the past, it's been, I guess, 7 years now, 2017. And that this is an ongoing conversation, but I think that the through line that we've always had has been that what was the coalition that the Democrats had is changing, and like it just needed to there was more effort needed to be paid to all the parts of that coalition, and that never happened at the institutional Democratic level, and the results, the 2024 results, are directly on that through line of that not working. So of that working.
Right. And just to clarify for listeners who might not be as like read in on these, this sort of debate between mobilization and persuasion, is when Dan says, so we don't just get thrown into the mobilization bucket, which we do believe in mobilization, that's part of it. But like that's a turnout. Like the whole idea is, well, if you just turn out enough people, you win. That's kind of the mobilization bucket. Whereas the persuasion bucket is, well, if we can make the right argument typically people think of it if we can make the right argument to like flip voters to voting for you, then you can win. And what we firmly believe is that it's totally possible to do both, and we need to do both. We must be doing both, right? And with all of our messaging and with all of our programming, our aim is to be both mobilizing and persuading, which we talk about as persuasionism or
Hmm.
mobisuasion, something along those lines. I just wanted to make that clear for people who like don't spend their time immersed in all these like these details. So,
Yeah,
Yeah.
did
and
you
just
want to add?
very
Yeah.
quickly on that. The a lot of times like you framed it as an argument. I think typically in a lot of Democratic circles, it's not even really framed as an argument so much as just resources. It's just money. Like we're just going to spend money on those groups, and like that, I think is part of the thinking that it hasn't served us well and kind of needs to change too.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of believe at the root of a mobilization strategy is it's just like sort of taking people for granted. It's like people are just going to come out, because you told them when the election is, or, I think that idea of mobilization is just like it's like a surface level thing when what we need to do is deeper. And especially because of what Dan talked about with the media ecosystem, everybody is cross-pressured. So many more people are cross-pressured than you think. It's not just about being targeted by an ad campaign. It's just like in the water that everyone is swimming in. And so you have to assume that everyone you're basically a lot of people, not anyone who's kind of, not a super activist like we are, who's like really, really plugged in and already knows, has organizations they work for and is like already knows what's going on. People who are just mostly living their lives and politics is like the 15th thing that they might think about in the day. It's those people who are really, really cross-pressured. And so it's just, I think gone are the days when we had that more, I don't know, that idea that you could just mobilize people. I just don't think I think it's the idea of it is kind of dead, honestly. And we need to move to um a different way of thinking where it's like every moment of the day is a chance to persuade someone into our worldview.
Right. All right. Let's move on to one other topic that came up in this Edsel article that has really baffled me because it kind of keeps coming up and it just feels like political malpractice to me in a way that I'm like, really? Are people really arguing for this? It's a fairly new concept, or at least to me, this was a new concept. Maybe this concept has been bubbling up for a while, but um, so in moderate circles, it comes up again in Edsel's piece, the idea that Democratic candidates, should sever themselves from small dollar donors because small dollar donations trap candidates into moving left on issues in order to appeal to the masses, which I just have to say, horrors to that you would actually listen to the people who are giving money to you and whatever. But I have to, before turning Jen and Dan loose on this, I want to say that this idea of severing candidates, first, what they were arguing in the Edsel piece was that like once candidates got on Act Blue and start getting small dollar donations through Act Blue, they started becoming more liberal, voting more liberal, spouting more liberal policies, all that stuff. But um, what was what's crazy, there's two things that are crazy to me about this is that number one, the idea that, well, if you just sever candidates from small dollar donors, they won't be dependent on that, but they will be dependent on dark money and billionaire donors, and somehow that's a better idea. I mean, that is crazy talk to me. And one other thing that I just find to be crazy talk is in the Trump era, small dollar donations in particular, which have, real advantages for candidates. It gives them a huge advantage in terms of message control, figuring out when and where they're going to spend money rather than like getting money from having PACs go out and do their bidding. But that smaller dollar donations have arguably been one of Democrats' most consistent electoral advantages in the Trump era. So this is one of the like most baffling ideas to me. All right, I'm with that setup. I'm gonna turn Jen and Dan loose on this.
I, I I'll start with something kind of like just a quick observation about it. The I mean this idea that like anything that so one of the quotes in the piece, I won't say who it's from, is the reality, anything that empowers online donor mechanically disempowers non-white and working class Democrats. Look, the the leaps of faith that you have to make to understand what that sentence is arguing for is wild. And this again goes back to sort of the premise of what we're talking about here. The argument there is that Democrats are losing because they're too far left, and like if the small donors want the Democrats to move left and they move left, then they'll lose. That is not what's going on. Okay. Like, look at it from the perspective of, a non-white or working class Democrat who over the past 50 years has seen their prices go up, has seen their income go down, has seen, their rent went up by $400, over, when they were in, there was a person I talked to in Nevada who her rent had gone up $400 and she was making minimum wage. Like, they're way more mad about that than they are about whether a Democrat has moved a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right on like some issue that like they aren't tracking, right? Like they need to hear that someone is going to fight for them, and they really need to hear a story about why things feel so broken. And that is what the Democrats, the Harris campaign didn't try to do that. Nobody has done that. The right is doing a great job of telling them why things are so broken. It's because of immigrants and because of trans kids, right? And until the Democrats come up with a story and start to tell that, and like we did a poll. I didn't bring it up. I didn't do my homework the way that Jenifer did. She had the memo ready to go. But like we did a poll that was about like, look, do you what's a bigger problem? Is it woke or is it the fact that 50 trillion, this $50 trillion thing? And it was like it was 2 to 1 something, or more than that, 3 to 1
Yeah, we
maybe.
talked about it last time, I think.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
talked about it before, right? But that
It's
is
two,
so critical.
just let's be clear. It was 2 to 1 in favor of the reason things are so broke is because $50 trillion has been
If
sucked
you
away
pit
from
those things
right.
against each other, and we're going to
Right.
ask this question again, we're going to say, maybe it's the size of government, but the right is always coming up. There's a new thing every week. This week it's the park rangers, like, it's whoever
Yeah.
Elon is mad at this week, right? They always come up with a new thing. The Democrats have to start telling that story
Yeah.
and making that apart. And Americans kind of already believe it, which is it's a lot easier to tell a story like if there's already a lot of people that agree with you, and you've already got a head start, and you're not telling them something totally, completely new and out of this, out of the blue, and that there's a big advantage there. And like I just think like this is yet again an area where the story that you have about what happened is so critical for determining the strategy going forward now.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I was thinking about it because if you think about who is a leader who has put working people at the center of what they're doing, whose policies would actually affect working people the most in a positive way. It's like, who do you think of? You know, I do you want to guess who's in my mind? Who's like a leader? Who's like a
Two
current
popped,
leader? Huh?
two popped into my head.
Bernie?
I
Yeah,
would
sure.
Bernie.
if right, I would say Bernie or I would say AOC too. I think
AOC
Right.
was
she's
the
kind of
second one.
yeah.
So
Right.
Bernie Sanders, who's like the only leader he's the only one out there right now. He's on an oligarchs tour. Like he's the only one who's actually trying to help working people. Where did this whole
Not
thing
a
come
Democrat,
from?
even.
Right, but like remember back in the day, it was the $27 donation. His whole campaign was fueled by a $27 donation, and that what he raised more money than anyone thought possible with that kind of small dollar donation.
And Jen, he was radicalized by the $27 donation.
I'm
No,
just
joking.
saying it's interesting to me that third way is coming out with this like comeback thing with like God knows what kind of corporations are funding this stuff. And they're calling out the problem with small dollar donations, which is literally the only thing that allowed Bernie Sanders to even come close to, winning the presidential nomination, for example. Like it is connected. And it's like it's completely ridiculous that you would say that small dollar donations are hurting working people when it's literally the only thing that can like fuel a working class candidate to represent people and actually put out policies that help working people and aren't beholden to corporations that are trying to screw over
And
working
what
people.
happens then is, Bernie or whoever takes off and then immediately walks into this buzzsaw of not just the Republicans who who oppose him and call him whatever kinds of names.
Right.
But also this roughly half of the Democratic Party who then immediately line up against him aggressively. And like, I'm not a like DNC truther or whatever. I think like the DNC like jiggered the schedules or whatever a little bit in 2020, but like,
Mhm.
come on, like it was like
Yeah.
the Bernie movement had real problems when they went to South Carolina, and they need to grapple with that, why that is, right?
Right. I'm just
Like
saying, I
that's a
don't
big
think
deal,
I'm just
like,
saying they're
but
trying to say it's made us more leftist, but it's actually made us more accountable to working people. And that is like the dishonesty of what they're putting out.
And that's I think at their core, that's what they want is less accountability to working people, less responsiveness to working people, so that like these people in Washington get to kind of call all the shots because they only have to listen to these really highly moneyed donors and whatever. You know, the flip side of this is that this is I'm going to try something out here. Hadn't planned it, but the flip side of this is that this is where how Republicans, establishment Republicans, not Trump, but establishment Republicans ended up where they did, right? Which is they have been, as soon as they got the dark money flowing and you couldn't tell who their donors were and they were just getting gobs of cash this way, they just let their small dollar donations for the most part kind of just trickle out to some extent. Dan's not going to believe, he doesn't believe this, but wait, let me finish before you
yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
let me finish. So I think that actually establishment Republicans became completely unresponsive to a base that was actually up in arms, that was sort of rabid, the Tea Party movement and that whole thing. The establishment Republicans kind of wanted to like, I think they didn't want to have to be responsive to that. And that's how they ended up where they did in 2013. Dan wants to blow holes in this. Anyways, so
No,
oh no.
I see where you're going, and I think I
Okay.
totally agree.
That's
Right?
that's how they ended up in 2013 where they had been once again defeated by Barack Obama and they did that whole autopsy and they were like, "Oh my God, we've got to like move to the center and reach out to more people and whatever." And the grassroots was like, "No way." They were really really ticked off about that. And without Donald Trump sort of manufactured through hostility and horrible policies and status threats and scapegoating, innocent people and stuff like that. But he managed to resurrect the Republican Party from where it was because it was in a disastrous place in 2013. And the establishment Republicans in Washington were not at all in touch with their voters at that point.
Yeah. And he did that by doing the literal exact total opposite of everything that was in that autopsy, right? And that is where this advice that's in this Edsel column becomes even sort of more mind-bending. Is like, we have an example of an extremely successful movement, like in the political movement, and it did none of these things. It didn't. There's that now. The only what the reactionary centrist types will say in response to this is that Donald Trump was perceived as more moderate. The reason we all know he's not. Anybody who's paying attention at all knows he's wildly radical on this. The reason he's not is because, and this is another problem with this strategy, they have so much media power, they can label anything and anyone they want as with whatever they want for whatever reason. They can make stuff up. They can say, you know, oh, the Haitians are eating pets and Democrats support that. They can talk about, I was just looking at Congress ads from last year. They can talk about defunding the police for 10 years. No Democrat has supported that, and wherever. No Democrat has told a strong story about what will make us safe, right? So like those labels will stick forever unless they get overwritten by some stronger message. And there's this the world has changed from the world that the people in this Edsel article are talking about, and what Third Way is talking about. Like, it is a very different media environment. It is a very different oppositional environment. We are in a whole different world, and we have to adapt to that.
Agree. I would add that Donald Trump himself personally benefited from 15 years of being normalized on a,
On TV,
reality TV show where he fired people. You know what I mean? And people
we
were like,
love
he's not that
Survivor.
bad. Yeah.
Mark Burnett is as responsible for this moment as anyone.
For
it's
putting to for
right,
producing The Apprentice.
right, exactly.
Yes. Yes. So,
Yeah.
okay,
I'm
we
sure
have
he
got
didn't know. Right? He didn't know where this was going.
we have reached the end of my planned things on this, and I wanted to open it up for either Jen or Dan to weigh in with something, some sort of parting thought or something that you've been thinking about or noodling on this week, maybe related to this and maybe not related to this conversation.
Sure. Well, I mean, definitely the budget stuff is on our minds because March 14th is the deadline for, passing some kind of continuing resolution or something in order to keep the government open. And it's been honestly, this date has been in everyone's mind since the administration started because it was always known as like when the government might have to shut down. And so all of the kind of organizing that you've seen to try to get Democrats to hold the line on different things. I think that people thought that the Republicans were going to have a harder time. It does seem like something has shifted in their House caucus, where they used to have these Freedom Caucus folks who wouldn't vote for anything that would increase the debt, et cetera. But they're kind of throwing that all out the window. It's kind of crazy to me that they were able to hold their caucus together to pass that crazy continuing resolution in the House this week. But thankfully, we have the Senate. It's just another reminder that the Senate is kind of our only institutional stopgap in some ways to this moment, when you don't have the, majority in the House. And so there's been a whole run up to this week of like, what's going to happen? Is the Democratic leadership going to cave? The CR that the Republicans put forward is absolutely insane. Like it's not the kind of thing that just keeps the government going. It basically just opens up a blank check for what Musk is doing. And so this moment is actually really important for whatever power we can muster to show that what's happening with Musk, and Doge is not okay. It's like actually critical. So I called my senators this morning to be part of this push. But there was some new polling that came out that I thought was really helpful. And maybe this is part of what has gotten Schumer and some of the Democrats to like do the right thing, which I'm seeing some news today that seems like they're saying they're not going to vote for this or that,
Let me just
yeah, go
let me
ahead.
just say, just for this moment of time, because by the time we publish this, post
Yeah,
this, we'll probably have we might have the fuller story on how this all played out. But just now, within the past hour, we've gotten news that Senate Democrats held the line and did not vote for this particular form of the bill, and they want a continuing resolution for 30 days rather than one that goes through September, I think.
right.
So they're looking
That's
to do
actually
something
clean.
that's actually clean, that
Mm,
doesn't provide all these extra powers for Musk and Trump,
mm,
and that would only hold for 30 days, and then we would go back to the drawing board on
mhm.
something. So just that's where we are at the moment. But Jen, please go ahead.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, no, no. So Data for Progress did some polling this week, and had a question in kind of their usual like look at public opinion that and it actually touches back to some of the conversations we had before about like what James Carville was saying about Democrats should just play dead, et cetera, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. And so they tested these two statements with Democrats and independents who kind of more lean toward Democrats. And so the question was, which of the following statements is closest to your opinion on how Democrats in Congress should approach the Trump administration, even if neither is exactly right? And so the two statements were, one, keep their heads down and allow Trump and Republicans to expose themselves as incapable of governing. And then the second one was fight back as much and as visibly as possible against Trump's attacks on Americans' freedoms. And the numbers were, the people who thought we should keep our heads down and just let Republicans, make their own bed was 18% of Democrats and independents. And then the people who thought we should be fighting as much and as visibly as possible, it was 82%. So I think that is, I was like gratified by this. And I think everyone should know, like, yes, how you feel, most of us people listening to this is actually quantified with polling that shows, yes, like a vast, vast majority of people believe that we should be fighting. And so I'm glad that they actually did do that today. So that was my one little thing that's been on my mind.
4 out of 5 Democrats and independents agree you guys should do your jobs. uh,
Well, I mean, and I will say that's happening. What's interesting to me about that is I don't think that Democrats have been making really aggressive arguments here. So that polling is happening even in the context of a situation where
Hmm.
Democrats haven't been presenting super bold, super like in your face arguments to the American people. And, so like
Yeah.
I think that polling actually could be better if Democrats had been more aggressively and consistently making the same argument. But anyway.
Yeah, like I watching this Senate situation play out, like I'm a couple of the group chats I'm in are with people who understand this way more, with the inner workings of the Senate, and it is insanely frustrating. Like the people who do
Mm.
this stuff, and people who have been on the Hill and who work there, because there's so many different ways for senators to evade responsibility for the actual decisions they're making. It's really, really hard to understand that. Strongly recommend getting on the blue ski. We'll retweet some of these people from the Way to Win account. It's following like people like Murshid Zahid. He's doing an amazing job. Josh Marshall is doing a great job at TPM. There's a crew of of a half dozen other people who are tracking this stuff and really following it. And like you can't know if you just read the story in the paper about this, you will not understand what's going on. We should watch Chris Hayes tonight. He will probably do a good do a story on this too.
Mm.
But it is an area. I know a lot of people feel stressed out by the news right now. This is fascinating to watch, right? Like this is like amazing drama. It's really like pen pressure from people. If you're making calls, please keep making calls. You're doing a great job because we don't know how it's going to play out, but they are absolutely hearing us. This would have sailed through without you all making calls. So if you've been making calls this week, you've done an amazing job. You've done an amazing thing, and they're hearing you. How it will play out, we don't know, but this was always going to be a tough fight. And there's downsides that are
Yeah.
scary too. Like it's like a shutdown is bad and we don't want that. And like the Republicans kind of don't care. And we have to take that into account. But this seems like the right thing to do and the right way to
I'll,
go.
I'll
Yep.
absolutely say that anyone who's ever worked or talked about, been like in a congressional office when you're getting a flood of calls and, emails and things about something is that absolutely matters and makes a huge difference in what kind of backbone a senator or a congressperson will show.
And
So,
staffers who are dealing with the stuff, when I was I actually got through to Padilla's staff. Respect to you guys, Senator Padilla's staff in San Francisco. Thank you so much again, staffers. You're doing a great job. We know it's tough. And
yeah.
if when you're calling, just be super nice to those people. Like that their job is it's hard. Like,
I'm gonna close out real quick with something that I honestly I've thought about a lot during the week. I listened to the Pod Save America. They did a interview with Alistair Campbell, who helped resurrect the Labour Party in Britain in the late 90s after it had been basically decimated by Margaret Thatcher for like consecutive, like decades, I think is what it was. But he argued, I really enjoyed, if you could find it, I would go listen to it. I really enjoyed it. I have been continually feeling like no one is sort of thinking big enough about this moment. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't some good attempts, but I just feel like, even some of the sniping inside the Democratic factions about what we should do and how we should do it's just like not big enough for the moment. And he was saying that he argued, among other things, that rather than Democrats moderating, he argued exactly the opposite. This moment calls on Democrats to be bigger and bolder. And I'm just going to say, quote unquote, when there is so much angst in the world, you've got to have a disruptive message about change that you are going to make because so much needs to be changed or so much needs to change. The status quo just isn't working. So he was like adamant. He wasn't even he waffled not even a little, but that instead of moderating, Democrats should be going bigger, bolder, and making a more disruptive message. And I know there's a lot of Democrats in Washington, a lot of people in just Washington in general who aren't situated to do something super disruptive. But I think that's what the moment calls for. So, Dan?
just to add something really quickly to this, we are going to have sound on here soon from focus groups. We're working on it. It's a little bit of a tricky thing to set up. But I've gotten to listen to a few focus groups that Ekis has run, a few other groups, and the through line that we've come through, people are like, I don't understand how people could vote for Trump. Voters just wanted change. It aligns perfectly what Alistair Campbell said. I mean, that has been the overwhelming signal that I've gotten from from the handful of focus groups that I've listened to since the election. All no matter whether they voted for say no, all of them just they want to change.
Okay, I think we will leave it there. Thanks to Jenifer and Dan for joining me. No? Okay.
Thank you.
Oh,
Perfect.
thank you, Kerry.
Nailed it. Nailed it.
Cheers.
All right. Thank you to our listeners. We appreciate you and your dedication to the work of rebuilding our democracy, which at its core is about building coalitions and common cause across groups with different biographies and lived experiences. I'm going to keep encouraging all of you because we continue to get new joiners to find ways to stay connected locally, have dinner with your neighbors, join random local groups, whatever they might be, knitting, gardening, emergency stuff, whatever. That's what I personally did. Whatever it takes to build out your local network, because authoritarian movements count on people feeling disconnected, alone, powerless, and connecting locally is an antidote to feeling that disconnection. Also, if you appreciate what we are doing here on this podcast and Substack, which is also called Charting the Way Forward, follow us, rate us, give us high marks, say what you want to hear more of. It's super helpful. We'd be thrilled to count you as a part of our crew. You can also, as Dan mentioned, find Way to Win on Blue Sky, our social media home. And with that, we will see you next Thursday. Until then, do good, be well, hug your loved ones, and tell your dog I say hi.